The Haunting of Hollowridge. Unveiling the Secrets Beneath the Surface. A supernatural horror story. The winding road to Hollowridge felt like it stretched on forever. Dense, towering trees lined both sides, their branches intertwined to create a canopy that blocked out the late afternoon sun. Evelyn Marshall gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as she glanced at her husband, Henry, who sat beside her, scanning the map on his phone. "We should be there any minute now," Henry muttered, his voice steady, though a hint of doubt lingered. The realtor said it's just beyond the woods. In the back seat, their 12-year-old daughter, Sophie, stared out the window. She hadn't said much since they'd left the city earlier that morning. Hollowridge was supposed to be a fresh start, an escape from the noise and bustle of city life. But as they drove deeper into the rural outskirts, the eerie isolation began to feel less like an escape and more like a trap. "There it is," Henry pointed ahead. Emerging from the forest's edge was a sprawling mansion, Hollowridge Manor. Its stone walls were covered in ivy and the windows, though intact, were dark and unwelcoming. The surrounding grounds were overgrown, with weeds climbing up the wrought iron fence that encircled the property. Evelyn took a deep breath as they pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching on gravel. The house was magnificent in its own way, but there was something about it that made her feel uneasy. She dismissed the feeling, chalking it up to nerves. "What do you think, Soph?" Henry asked, turning toward their daughter. "Quite the upgrade from our apartment, huh?" Sophie shrugged, still gazing at the house. "It's big." As they stepped out of the car, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending a chill through the air. Evelyn walked toward the front door, feeling an odd sense of being watched. She shook it off and smiled as Henry unlocked the door. "Welcome to your new home," he said, pushing it open. The interior was grand, with high ceilings and antique furnishings, but the air was stale, and a faint smell of dust lingered. Sunlight filtered in through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the hardwood floors. Sophie wandered off on her own, exploring the rooms one by one. As she reached the top of the staircase, she paused. At the end of the hall, just outside a closed door, stood a woman. Her figure was shadowy, her dress tattered and old-fashioned. Sophie blinked and the woman was gone. Her heart raced as she stood frozen in place. She wanted to scream for her parents, but something stopped her. Instead, she slowly backed away and hurried downstairs. "Everything okay, sweetie?" Evelyn asked, noticing the pale look on her daughter's face. "Yeah, I'm fine," Sophie lied, glancing back up the stairs. The hall was empty now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something that wasn't supposed to be there. The first night at Hollowridge was quiet, too quiet. Despite the large size of the house, every creak of the floorboards and groan of the wooden beams echoed through the halls. Evelyn lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Henry was already snoring softly beside her, seemingly at ease in their new home. But Evelyn's mind was restless. She slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway, the soft light of the moon spilling through the windows. As she passed one of the rooms on the second floor, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Curious, she pushed it open. The room was small, sparsely furnished with a single chair and a dusty, moth-eaten rug. But something caught her eye, a set of letters, yellowed with age, stacked neatly on the floor near the window. Evelyn knelt down and picked up the top letter. The handwriting was elegant, but the ink had faded, making it difficult to read. "Dearest Eliza," it began, "I fear our time is running out. The walls of this house whisper secrets I cannot bear to hear." Evelyn's heart quickened. Who was Eliza? And what secrets did this house hold? She gathered the letters and hurried back to her bedroom, intent on reading more in the morning. As she climbed back into bed, she noticed Sophie standing in the doorway, her eyes wide. "Mom, there's a lady upstairs," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Evelyn frowned. "What do you mean, honey? There's no one else here." She was wearing a long dress. "I saw her," Sophie insisted. Evelyn sighed, trying to keep her voice calm. "It's probably just your imagination. This house is old, and old houses can make us see things that aren't really there." but Sophie shook her head. No, she was real. The next morning, Evelyn decided to investigate further. While Henry and Sophie were out in the garden, she returned to the small room where she had found the letters. As she sifted through the rest of them, a name appeared again and again: Eliza Carrington. Evelyn's curiosity grew. Who was Eliza? And why had her letters been left behind? As she dug deeper, she discovered something even more unsettling. Behind the faded wallpaper on one of the walls, there was a hidden door. Her pulse quickened as she hesitated, then slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow, dusty staircase leading down into darkness. A cold draft swept up from below, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of decay. The hidden staircase beckoned, but Evelyn hesitated at the threshold. She called out for Henry, her voice low but urgent. Moments later, he appeared, wiping his hands on his jeans, a frown creasing his brow. "What is it?" Henry asked, noticing the strange door. Evelyn pointed down the staircase. "I found this hidden behind the wallpaper." Henry raised an eyebrow. "That's weird. Do you think it leads to a cellar?" "Only one way to find out," Evelyn replied, her voice laced with unease. Henry grabbed a flashlight from the nearby shelf, its beam cutting through the darkness. Slowly they descended the creaky stairs, the air growing colder with every step. Dust swirled in the light, and the smell of damp earth and mold filled their lungs. At the bottom of the stairs they found a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with crumbling bricks, and the only piece of furniture was an old wooden table covered in dust and cobwebs. On the table lay a tattered leather-bound journal. Evelyn reached out and picked up the journal, her fingers brushing against the cold, cracked leather. She opened it, revealing pages filled with scrawled handwriting. "It's Michael Carrington's," she whispered, glancing at Henry. Henry flipped through the pages, the entries becoming more frantic and erratic as they went on. "I am a prisoner in my own home. Eliza, she knows. She watches me even in the dark. The house is alive with her fury. I can't escape her." As they continued reading, the horror of Michael's words became clearer. He had been tormented by his wife, Eliza. Accusations of infidelity had spiraled into something far darker, a supernatural presence haunting the halls of Hollowridge. Suddenly, a cold gust of air swept through the room, extinguishing the flashlight. Evelyn gasped, clutching Henry's arm. "We need to go," Henry said quickly, his voice tense. "Now." They hurried back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind them. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of what they had read. Was it just the ramblings of a man descending into madness, or was there something more sinister lurking in the shadows of Hollowridge? That night, Sophie's nightmares began. She tossed and turned in her bed, her dreams filled with visions of the woman she had seen on the first night, the woman in the long dress. Eliza's pale face, twisted with anger, loomed over her, whispering her name in a voice that sent chills down her spine. Sophie bolted upright, drenched in sweat. Her room was dark, save for the sliver of moonlight creeping through the curtains. But then in the corner of the room she saw her, Eliza Carrington. The ghostly figure stood silently, her eyes hollow and empty, her mouth twisted in a grimace of pain and fury. Sophie wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Her body was frozen in fear as Eliza slowly stepped toward her, her hand outstretched as if reaching for her. "Why are you here?" Eliza's voice was a raspy whisper, echoing in Sophie's mind. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, praying it was just a nightmare. But when she opened them again, Eliza was still there, standing just inches from her bed. "I need help," Eliza whispered. "He lied to me, he betrayed me, they all did." Suddenly the figure vanished, leaving Sophie gasping for breath, her heart racing in terror. She scrambled out of bed and ran to her parents' room, tears streaming down her face. "Mom? Dad?" Sophie cried, shaking Evelyn awake. Evelyn sat up, alarmed. "What's wrong, Sophie?" "She was in my room," Sophie sobbed, trembling. "The woman, Eliza. She said she needs help." Henry groaned, rubbing his eyes. Sophie, it's just a bad dream. There's no ghost. But Sophie shook her head furiously. No, it wasn't a dream. She's real. Evelyn's heart sank as she looked into her daughter's terrified eyes. Sophie had never been one to imagine things, and after everything they had discovered, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie might be telling the truth. We'll figure this out, Evelyn said, hugging Sophie tightly. I promise. But as they sat there, Evelyn couldn't help but feel that something terrible was coming. Something they couldn't escape. The next morning, Evelyn called Dr. Lawrence Blackwood, the town's historian and an expert on Hollowridge's past. He had been recommended by the locals when they'd first arrived, though at the time, Evelyn hadn't thought much of it. Now, with everything they had experienced, she felt a growing need to understand the mansion's dark history. Dr. Blackwood arrived later that afternoon, his appearance as old and withered as the house itself. He wore a tweed jacket and carried a briefcase filled with documents and photographs. Thank you for coming, Evelyn greeted him at the door, leading him into the living room where Henry and Sophie were waiting. Dr. Blackwood sat down and opened his briefcase, pulling out a faded photograph of the Carrington family standing in front of Hollowridge. Eliza and Michael Carrington stood together, their expressions serious. Beside them was another man, a figure Evelyn didn't recognize. This is the Carrington family, Dr. Blackwood explained. They lived here in the late 1800s. Michael Carrington was a wealthy businessman, but his life ended tragically. He disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and his body was never found. What about Eliza? Evelyn asked. Dr. Blackwood hesitated. Eliza's story is complicated. After Michael's disappearance, she became increasingly unstable. There were rumors that she had a hand in his death, though nothing was ever proven. Some say she went mad with grief and anger, convinced that Michael had betrayed her. Others believe she was cursed, haunted by the very house she lived in. Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze fixed on the photograph. I saw her, she whispered. I saw Eliza. Dr. Blackwood glanced at Sophie, his expression serious. Many people claim to have seen Eliza's ghost over the years. The locals believe she's still here, searching for something, or someone. Henry scoffed. You're not telling me you believe in this ghost nonsense, are you? Dr. Blackwood gave a small, knowing smile. I believe that Hollowridge has a history of tragedy and sorrow. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, the house has a way of holding on to its past. Evelyn's mind raced as Dr. Blackwood continued to explain the strange happenings that had plagued the house for decades. Sudden illnesses, unexplained disappearances, and the occasional sighting of a ghostly woman wandering the halls. When Dr. Blackwood finally left, the air in the house felt heavier, more oppressive. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor, and Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, as Evelyn lay in bed, her mind replaying Dr. Blackwood's words, she heard something soft like the rustling of fabric. She sat up, her pulse quickening. There, standing at the foot of the bed, was Eliza Carrington. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The ghost's eyes were filled with sorrow, her mouth forming silent words. Evelyn's body froze in place as she stared at the spectral figure. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, Eliza vanished, leaving Evelyn trembling in the dark. The days passed in a tense, uneasy silence. Hollowridge's dark presence grew more palpable, as if the very air inside the house was thick with secrets yet to be uncovered. Evelyn found herself increasingly drawn to the hidden journal entries left behind by Michael Carrington. She needed to know more to understand why Eliza's ghost was haunting them, and what it all meant. One afternoon, while Henry took Sophie out for a walk to clear her mind, Evelyn returned to the small hidden room where they had found the journal. She sat by the dim light of a single bulb and flipped through the remaining entries, each more desperate than the last. Eliza grows more dangerous every day. I can't sleep without seeing her standing at the foot of my bed, accusing me of things I didn't do. I fear for my life. As Evelyn read on, a new name appeared, Daniel Wade. She remembered seeing the name before in one of Dr. Blackwood's documents, a former business partner of Michael Carrington. The journal implied that Wade had somehow betrayed Michael, which had caused Eliza's anger to spiral into violence. Evelyn realized that this betrayal might have been the key to everything. But there was more. Michael hinted that something was buried beneath the house. Something that Wade had helped him hide. As Evelyn reached the final entry, her breath caught in her throat. The truth lies below. She will never forgive me. God help me. Her heart raced. If the truth about Michael's betrayal and Eliza's madness was buried beneath the house, it might explain why the haunting had continued all these years. But where beneath the house? The cellar? The basement? Evelyn was determined to find out. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Evelyn confided in Henry. They agreed that they needed to dig deeper, literally. Tomorrow we'll search the basement, Henry said. If something's down there, we'll find it. The following morning they ventured into the basement, flashlights in hand. The cold, damp air hit them like a wave, and the smell of earth and mildew was overpowering. The basement was cluttered with old, forgotten belongings. Rusted tools, broken furniture, and boxes filled with dust-covered trinkets. As they combed through the clutter, Evelyn noticed something unusual, a patch of the stone floor that seemed out of place, as if it had been disturbed and hastily covered up. Kneeling down, she brushed the dirt aside, revealing a trapdoor hidden beneath a loose stone slab. "Henry, look!" she called out, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. Henry hurried over, helping her lift the heavy slab. Beneath it was a small, narrow tunnel that descended even further into the earth. "This must be it," Henry muttered. "Whatever Michael buried, it's down there." With a deep breath, they both climbed down into the tunnel, the walls pressing in on either side. The further they descended, the colder it became, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. The faint echo of their footsteps was the only sound as they reached the bottom. There, at the end of the tunnel, they found what they had been looking for. A chest, covered in cobwebs and dirt, its lock rusted and broken. Evelyn hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling. She could feel the weight of Eliza's presence all around them, as if the ghost was watching, waiting for them to uncover her truth. Inside the chest was a bundle of old letters, a small lockbox, and a bundle of bones, neatly wrapped in decaying fabric. Evelyn gasped, stepping back in horror. The remains were small, too small for an adult. A child. "Oh my God," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. "What is this?" Evelyn reached for the lockbox, her hands shaking. When she opened it, she found a letter written in the same handwriting as Michael's journal. To Daniel Wade. "You will be paid handsomely for your silence. Eliza must never know. The child was never hers." Evelyn stared at the letter in shock. The bones in the chest, they belonged to the child mentioned in the letter. The child that Michael had hidden from Eliza. The betrayal had been far worse than Evelyn could have ever imagined. "Michael had a child with someone else," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Eliza never knew. But now she did." And her anger, her grief, had kept her spirit tied to Hollowridge, searching for the truth that had been hidden from her for so long. That night, Hollowridge was alive with whispers, the walls seemingly pulsing with Eliza's rage. The discovery of the child's remains had disturbed the fragile balance of the house, and the spirit was more restless than ever. Evelyn lay awake, her mind racing, replaying the events of the day. The child had been Michael's secret, a betrayal of Eliza that had driven her to madness. But what had happened to Michael? Had Eliza killed him in her fury? Or had someone else, Daniel Wade perhaps, played a part in his disappearance? Suddenly, the air in the room grew colder, and the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Evelyn sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She knew what was coming. "Eliza," she whispered to herself. The door to the bedroom creaked open, and the ghostly figure of Eliza Carrington appeared once more. Her eyes were wide and hollow, her mouth contorted in a silent scream. This time, there was no mistaking the fury that radiated from her spectral form. I know what you did, Eliza hissed, her voice barely more than a breath. He lied to me, they all lied. Evelyn stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Eliza stepped closer, her cold, ghostly hand reaching out toward Evelyn. But then, something unexpected happened. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her small figure framed by the dim light from the hallway. Stop! Sophie cried, her voice strong and commanding. Eliza, stop! The ghost hesitated, her hand hovering just inches from Evelyn's face. Slowly, she turned to Sophie, her expression softening for just a moment. Sophie stepped forward, her eyes locked on Eliza's. We found the truth, she said. You were right. Michael lied to you. He hid your child from you. Eliza's face twisted with sorrow, her once raging spirit now flickering like a dying flame. Tears streamed down Sophie's face as she continued, but it's over now. You can rest. For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with emotion. Then, slowly, Eliza's ghost began to fade, her figure dissolving into the shadows of the room. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the oppressive weight lifted, the house finally quiet. Eliza was gone. Sophie collapsed into Evelyn's arms, sobbing quietly. It's over, she whispered. The days following Eliza's disappearance were eerily quiet. Hollowridge, once oppressive and full of tension, felt different, lighter. The house no longer echoed with the creaks and groans of restless spirits. Yet, something still gnawed at Evelyn, a lingering question that refused to let her fully relax. She couldn't stop thinking about the journal's final entry and the mysterious Daniel Wade. Though Eliza's spirit had been laid to rest, Evelyn had the nagging feeling that they hadn't uncovered the full truth about what had happened to Michael Carrington. Had Eliza killed him in her fit of madness, or had someone else played a part in his disappearance? Driven by these unanswered questions, Evelyn decided to visit Dr. Blackwood one last time. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Daniel Wade's role in this dark history. Maybe Dr. Blackwood had information he hadn't shared. Arriving at the historian's office in town, Evelyn was greeted with a kind but concerned look from Dr. Blackwood. Mrs. Marshall, I thought I might be seeing you again, he said, shuffling papers on his desk. You've come to ask about Daniel Wade, haven't you? Evelyn nodded. We've uncovered so much, but I can't let go of the fact that Daniel Wade's name kept coming up. Michael was afraid of him, but why? Dr. Blackwood leaned back, his face shadowed with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Daniel Wade was more than just a business partner to Michael. In fact, after Michael's disappearance, Wade took over the Carrington estate. He gained control of everything. There were whispers in town that Michael's disappearance was not an accident, but rather orchestrated by someone close to him. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. You think Daniel Wade had something to do with it? Dr. Blackwood nodded slowly. It's certainly possible. Wade had much to gain from Michael's absence. But the truth is lost to history now. Except, Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion, I don't think it is lost. Michael's body, it's still somewhere, isn't it? Dr. Blackwood's gaze sharpened. If Wade did kill him, it's very likely Michael's remains are still hidden on the Hollowridge grounds. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. They had found the remains of the child, but not Michael's. Could his body still be buried somewhere nearby, trapped beneath the earth just like the secrets he had tried so desperately to hide? Later that evening, Henry and Sophie joined Evelyn in the garden. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the house and grounds. But Evelyn's thoughts were far from peaceful. I think Michael's body is still here, Evelyn said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel Wade must have had something to do with his death, and he likely buried Michael somewhere on the property. Henry glanced at Sophie, then back at Evelyn, his face pale. You want to go looking for it, don't you? Evelyn nodded, her mind made up. We've come this far. We need to finish this. With flashlights in hand, they scoured the grounds as the last of the daylight faded. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. Sophie stayed close to her mother, a quiet determination on her young face. She too wanted to lay the past to rest. As they searched the property, Evelyn's instincts led her back to the overgrown corner of the garden, an area she had barely noticed before. It was secluded, hidden by a thicket of trees, with a patch of soil that seemed uneven, disturbed. "This is it," Evelyn whispered. Henry grabbed a shovel from the shed and together they began digging. The earth was cold and hard, but they pushed through, digging deeper with every stroke. After what felt like hours, the shovel hit something solid. Evelyn knelt down, brushing away the dirt with trembling hands. Beneath the earth lay a rotting wooden box, large and heavy, its lid splintered and decayed. Henry pried it open, and inside they found what they had been dreading: the skeletal remains of Michael Carrington. The air seemed to shift, the oppressive weight of the house returning for one final moment. But this time, it wasn't Eliza's presence they felt. It was Michael's. Sophie stepped forward, her eyes locked on the skeletal remains. "He didn't deserve this," she whispered, her voice filled with empathy. "But it's over now." Evelyn placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, nodding. "It's over." They gathered the bones carefully, deciding to give Michael the burial he had been denied for so many years. As they worked in silence, Evelyn felt the weight of Hollowridge's dark past finally lift. The house had been a prison not just for Eliza but for Michael as well. Now both spirits could rest. That night, for the first time since they had arrived, the house was truly still. No more whispers in the walls. No more cold drafts sweeping through the rooms. The dark history of Hollowridge had been unearthed, and with it, peace had finally returned to the Marshall family. Evelyn stood on the front porch, gazing out at the moonlit garden, now free of its buried secrets. Henry joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "What do we do now?" he asked softly. Evelyn smiled, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. "We live," she said simply. "We finally live." Sophie joined them on the porch, her small hand slipping into Evelyn's. Together they watched as Hollowridge stood tall against the night, no longer a house of shadows but a home, a place where the past had finally been laid to rest. If you enjoyed this supernatural horror story, be sure to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe for more chilling tales. Check out our playlist of horror stories for more spine-tingling experiences. See you in the next story.